Hello, everyone. I'm John Humphreys. I'm the Executive Director of the Association for Equity and Funding. And it's nice to be here with you to talk about legislative linkages and telling our story of low revenue districts and some of the financial challenges we face for boards, communities, and legislators. I'm joined today by Mike Jeuch. Mike is the Assistant Superintendent of Operations in Howard Swamco Schools. And Mike and I had a chance to meet at the School Boards Conference in January. And it was fun to chat about the maps that we were sharing. And Mike offered to share information with AEF very generously. Mike's got an interesting background as both a curriculum director and a superintendent in the Kenosha area prior to being in the business and operations world. So it's fun to have all that background and all that context for our conversation today. We're going to be talking again about some of those legislative linkages and telling your funding and financial story. So Mike, welcome. Thank you for joining us at AEF today. And what have you got to tell us about?
Very good. Thanks, John. I appreciate the time this morning and excited to share a little bit about our story. And some of the opportunities we've had in connecting with legislators. So I'll share my screen here and we'll walk through some of our story. Please feel free to ask questions as you have them throughout the presentation here. We will get started and ready to go here. All right. So I wanted to break this down and liked a little alliteration to start us off here too. Really getting into telling our story. We'll talk a little bit about our referendum process, which was a key to our communication with the community, and ultimately finishing up with our legislative linkages and our advocacy that we have been able to partner with our legislators and work through. So wanted to start it off with a quote. I think it's important too for context and just taking a look at where we begin, how our work impacts folks, and just doing things well and helping one another through this process. So I'll pause there for a moment. So starting off, telling our story. This has been something that's been interesting, and it predates my time in the district starting in 2020. So it's been something that's been ongoing. So credit to our board members throughout. Our superintendent, Damien LaCroix, has done a phenomenal job in leadership through this process. And it's really been about sharing that information. And we're happy to share that information, especially on the legislative linkage side and those community conversations we have, because we've seen a great deal of success with that and been able to develop relationships that go both ways and have been critical to impacting some of the school funding. So you'll see on the screen here too, Representative John Nygren, one of our legislators before he retired too, and being able to explain our story, talk about low revenue districts, and have an impact at the Capitol. And so it's something that our board has taken a lot of pride in with some adjustments that were made in 2018-19 for that year. And a lot of that stemmed from those conversations, especially when you have somebody in the Joint Finance Committee within your area. That's been critical. And also wanted to highlight, this is from last year's joint convention, our board sharing that information. And throughout this process, while I'm presenting, it's really going to be key work that took place by the board with our partnership, but it needs to be driven at the board table as well. And so it's critical to have that solid partnership and this be of interest too, beyond just the folks that are sitting in the chairs of the schoolhouse every day, but getting the board engaged and partnering on telling your story, sharing this information. Coming off and prior to my time, this has been a challenge. And I know everybody too is working through, especially the referendum side and where those state funding components take place. And this has been critical. And as I continue to tell the story throughout the presentation here too, just for context, 2017, Howard Swamco went to the ballot and we're looking for a referendum. And it was something that at the kind of the last minute, some resistance or opposition came forward and ultimately derailed that project and resulted in an unsuccessful referendum. And so you see on the signage, those started to appear. And what it required or demonstrated to the district was a need to continue to tell that story and share that information? And how did we reformat and refocus that? Well, it was clear to the district that the community was concerned about, as you can read there, per year forever. So we needed to look at a different strategy. And my predecessor, the individuals that were leading the organization at that time, in 2018 went back to the ballot box and requested an operational override for $5.85 million a year for 5 years. As you can see, the results are there, and that was successful. So I think some of the things we learned through that and leading into our latest referendum ask was making sure we're giving as much information as we can, trying to simplify school finance, because we know that anybody on this call or in general, if you can truly define school finance and provide that in a user-friendly context, you're going to be writing books and you're going to be presenting every day. So it's always a challenge. But we found, how can we start to convey that to folks? What are the important key components that they want to know, and how do we best explain that? And really for us, that got into the revenue limit conversation and helping folks build a knowledge of the impact that has on our organization. So fast forward to our Renew and Invest campaign in 2021, our ask component. Again, providing some additional context, because this was one of the keys to when we talk about community engagement within school finance and being able to explain those areas. You lose most folks, and I think we know that. When we get asked a question, those questions, usually you respond, and you start to lose folks probably 30 seconds, a minute into it. Of explain this in terms that I want to understand, and not that folks don't understand, but we know how complex it is, and most people want the elevator pitch answer. Again, for us through this campaign, discussing revenue limits was probably our biggest talking point, an area for folks to understand because of the impact that it has on Howard Suamico. And so that's continued to be a theme throughout. And while that's not unique to Howard Suamico, but a point of emphasis, it's also something that as we talk about our legislative advocacy involving that collaboration, so it doesn't pit organizations against one another, and we were able to collaborate. So one of the challenges we had, which I think provided a great opportunity for us to get into the weeds a little bit and simplify this process, is we were going to the ballot to ask for a $98 million facilities project, and continuing an operational override for $5 million for 5 years once the current 2018 referendum expired. And so with that, we were lowering the tax rate. And so this was something that it just created some confusion. How can you talk about lowering the tax rate? And then you're asking for, in essence, in 1 year, $103 million. And so it created a little bit of a challenge, because that doesn't make sense. And it really allowed us to have some conversations that got in depth on school finance. And we were able to present that where if folks wanted to understand the basic level, we could do that. If they wanted to go more in depth, we provided that. If they had specific questions, we were going to answer those, and we were going to share those answers out with individuals. So throughout this, you'll see some of our communication strategies. And getting into that was complex, but again, also, how do we simplify that? And that's where the conversation about the revenue limit really came in. And so what we did is we created a couple videos right here, and I've shared those. They're linked within the presentation and can be found on our website. So I'll share that out, and folks will have access to that as well. And I don't think there's nothing that's rocket science about this, but we tried to break these videos down. I'm blessed and fortunate to have a communications team that partners with us and is able to help me break down things. I tend to get excited about school finance, and I think we all do. We can get going, and then all of a sudden we're losing some folks. And so they've helped me to slow down with that and highlight a lot of those areas. And so what we did was really try to bring this home for folks. They wanted to know what was going to be the impact on their taxes. I think we've all had those conversations or those phone calls when the tax bills arrive. And so what we did is we put together some scenarios. And one thing we wanted to highlight for folks is, because we were dropping our tax levy rate, that didn't mean your taxes were going to go down. We've seen some pretty substantial property value, and our fair market value has been impacted. And so what we tried to do was be clear, be honest, and upfront about that, and then explain the why. And so by including that information for folks, it helped them to start to understand. And from there, we continued to follow up with different questions and break those components down. So these resources, again, are available on our website, and I'll share, but really help to speed up some of this conversation that needed to take place, because folks knew, and it was coming to the ballot box for them, and it was in their faces, and they wanted to ask questions, and it was a great opportunity that we needed to take advantage of as well to tell that story. So just from a context standpoint, this was something that was extremely helpful, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. We also were very upfront with questions, and this is also on the website, and I have that linked in the slide deck too. You asked a question, we put it on the website. And so we broke that down, and the answers there are all broken down, but getting into some of those specifics. So allowing folks to ask a simple question and let's get a longer answer. We'll answer your question, then we'll provide you more detail. Through this process, like many do in a referendum, we had a community task force. And part of our task force work was around school finance. And so we provided a ton of information for folks, and then walked away with, here are some talking points. If you take nothing out of our 10, 15-minute school finance presentation, here's what you can share with your neighbor. Here's the story that we need to tell. And a lot of the question came from that of, how can we also help to impact this? Because pushback we received was, we don't want to go to the ballot box. So you keep asking us for these referendum projects. What can we do to address this? And so that's really been a challenge of allowing folks to help and providing a direction for them. And that's really connected to our legislative advocacy, as well as just having champions for public education and around funding. And I think that's been really critical for an understanding of a local control component, but also what kind of action can be taken. And our referendum passed. It wasn't an overwhelming. I would have loved to have the higher percentages, but it passed. And helping folks understand that was critical. And we seem to be able to best tell the story, that continuing throughout this, which started really out of that 2017 and 2018 campaign season, to be able to bring that to light.
Mike, quick question for you. The videos you mentioned, how long were they?
The first one was about 3 minutes, and the second one was 6 minutes. And so we had probably half an hour worth of content, and I was told I had under 10 minutes. And we decided really to do both of those videos as, here's the more introductory one, and if you want to learn more, watch the second one. And so that, I think, was critical too, of meeting folks where they were at, but also not shying away from answering the tougher questions, knowing not everybody wanted to hear all of those details, but some folks were very much interested in that.
Yeah. And it's interesting that the connection you made with regard to the mill rate and the tax impact of this. While you were talking, I had a chance to pull up your data dashboard on your revenue limits. And one of the things that has been interesting to me, you're now the third or fourth district where the referendum amount equals the approximate deficit in your revenue limit as compared to the average revenue limit. So if your revenue limit had been at the state average since revenue limits were put into place in 1993-94, your district could have contributed $134 million more to the education of your students. And your referendum amount was $122 million total, the $5 million a year for 5 years plus the $98 million. I find that correlation pretty regularly. In fact, in the town where we live, we saw that as well between the operational and the facilities referenda, equaling that amount that the school district is in deficit to the average. And it just, it sort of lays bare the idea that the community, and these referenda are passing, the community wants to see spending at about that average level.
Yeah, definitely. And we looked at it internally. Our communications directors very much were both math minded. So we get into some of the statistics and some of those components. And we looked at even some of our neighboring districts. If we were at that same level, we decided ultimately that this wasn't a good opportunity for us to really get into an us versus them situation, because that doesn't benefit anybody. But it was nice to have that kind of information in our back pocket, just to utilize. So yeah, it's definitely been interesting, and yeah, definitely support that way. But it was also helping to tell the story. And let me give you the elevator pitch, and let me give you the more detailed one, where if you're concerned, you want to learn more, or you say, hey, what else is going on with school finance? Here we go. Here's that information, and we're making that available to you. So
yeah. Nice. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is one slide that I wanted to share. I had a conversation with a board member or board candidate, and we talked about just the revenue limit and operational referendum. And this particular board candidate is supportive, but does not want to continue to see referendum on the ballot. And how do we address that? And how do we fix that? And she asked me, and this is a very oversimplified version, and I think we could all poke a few holes in it, and that's fine. So I'm sharing this more just as context and kind of what was in this candidate's mind too, and I used a picture of my family there around the family table. And she said, so if I'm understanding this right, if we have the threshold, here's the dollars that we could potentially spend, except the state's telling us we can only spend this much. I have those additional dollars, but I can pay down some debt. In our situation is we can pay down debt with that, and pretty significantly. And then I need to have a family meeting or go to the ballot box to ask to utilize those dollars. I said, that's about as simple as we can make it. I said, there's a lot of other variables in that too, but that was something that clicked for her. And then I had another individual who asked me a little bit more about this, and this will be the only time, being a true Cubs fan, that you will probably see a Brewers slide in any sort of presentation that I do. Is I use this as the beer example, and I provided an explanation on this. And during COVID times, I couldn't have done this in person. I would have loved to, but talking about if we had a drink poured for us. And we talked about, I have a pint glass, except I'm only getting a 12-ounce beverage poured for me. There's some inequities in that. I want to fill that glass. But then if we talk about it too, we have the level of, we have some foam on that beverage. And if I don't like how much foam is on there, I want more of the beverage. I need to ask to have a repour for that. And that beverage is really the dollars that we can utilize. That foam represents kind of our debt payments for us. And if I don't like it and I want less foam and more beverage, I need to ask for another drink. And so it was something that some of these little things that, again, we can poke a whole lot of holes in these components, but it was something that folks related to and they understood and helped me explain that. I actually used that the beverage example with my brother-in-law, who lives in an organization that's going to the ballot box coming up here in a couple of weeks. And so I'm hopeful that that's one vote. And if it worked to help tell that story, perfect. But those were the types of things that were just little things of taking it from a slide deck or a picture there, putting it into something that in a casual environment was just a different response. And so it's something that I've kind of shared out there and been teetering a little bit with. But again, it's what met folks where they were at. Mm-hmm. And that kind of leading into this is the gentleman that's pictured here at the ball cap and has the clipboard. He attended one of our community info sessions for the referendum, asked a lot of really good questions. And it was outstanding. We were able to answer the questions. And then we spoke probably for another 45 minutes to an hour after the session. He's speaking to our board vice president there too, wanting to talk about funding. And one of his biggest questions is, what have you done about it? And so that kind of connects into our legislative advocacy. I was able to point to some very specific things and actions that our board had taken and continued to be involved with. And so it was a critical way of answering and addressing this gentleman's question. And so just through this, we've seen success. And you see that gentleman, and you see me in the background having the conversation with another community member. And then that other picture is from a previous district that I was a part of. It was a district of about 700 kids. So when you talk about, well, Howard Suamico, you have 6,000 kids, you're connected in the Green Bay area, you can do things a little bit differently. Yes, that's true. But it's also our smaller partner districts can also have success with that. And so having 2 representatives there. So we were able to continue these conversations. And then stemming out of this, one of the success stories we had was the village of Howard and the village of Suamico received their CARES dollars. And they could not use all of those dollars that they received from the pandemic. But we found a way to partner with them. They were going to send unused dollars back to the state capitol, and they were more interested in how do we use those locally. So we found partnerships and ways to do this. And this stemmed from a legislative linkage, a comment by one of our village officials to a state legislator and to the group. He had one of his aides handle that and address that immediately and found a way for us to do that. Being able to have those conversations and have those actions take place went from talking about it to being about it. And so I'll take us there, just on our advocacy and our legislative linkages. So we use a different governance structure, and part of our governance structure is around legislative or linkages in general, or community conversations. Every month, the board hosts a different group and has targeted questions. I have our latest legislative linkage questions for you, but it's something that they've taken a lot of pride in and worked on in order to engage our stakeholders, or in our governance model, our owners. And so bringing those folks to the table has allowed for these conversations that the board has led, has become very comfortable with, and I think has been what's led to a lot of the success of these legislative linkages, because of consistency, because of practice, and because of it being a priority for the board. Again, I always like to share some quotes throughout different presentations. And again, getting to the make it happen. And you'll notice down in the picture here, we have our board president and vice president with Representative Gallagher. So have at the national level, he came and walked through and presented our organization with a little award highlighting things that are happening in Northeastern Wisconsin. And so it was, again, another opportunity where establishing some of those connections allowed us to have somebody from the Capitol join us. And I know he has some thoughts on schools and the focus that way too. But again, being able to develop a relationship there to have a conversation. And again, not everybody's going to have access to those folks, but it's amazing the network that within communities we have. And being able to just have a conversation where now we have a more direct line, at least to an aide in his office, that if we want to talk about, a white paper that was released, we can share some feedback on that. But that's really been developed through an emphasis in working with our legislators. I think in a time right now, context-wise is so critical for what's going on within the state and within funding in general. And so some headlines over the last month that I think only contribute to the necessary nature of this work. You see too, the surplus that we've talked about at the state level here. Legislation that is going forward and that is shared. And so how do we again connect so that we're able to talk about these issues with the folks that are ultimately voting on them and supporting or going against them. And then right now, I think this is even more critical, just with retirements or those folks that are leaving the legislature. And this is an example. There's been subsequent retirements since this was posted, but again, sharing that information and being able to establish those connections, because yes, we had an outstanding relationship with Representative Nygren. Well, when he decided to retire, we had to go back and work on developing those relationships as well. And so just, I think it's a critical point and a critical juncture where folks have this opportunity to make sure they're making an introduction and partner through that. And I'm happy to provide some resources and supports for folks to be able to establish that. Again, this came out, I believe, yesterday too. 81 schools going to referendum. This is critical in telling our story. If you look at those numbers too, exceeding the revenue limits, 46 districts and over $200 million of approval. Folks need to understand that, and we need to be able to help them understand that, of why do we continue to have these asks. And so this is where those connections come in, of being able to also convey what are some of the messages we're hearing within the community, so they get a sense too of what's going on within their district from a different perspective. So I'll go into our most recent legislative linkage. So this was March 18th as identified. And we had folks representing the villages of Howard, villages of Suamico. We have our state senator and state representatives there as well. And then our board members, myself and our superintendent, our deputy superintendent, coming together and talking about those areas. And so this was a great conversation again, and I'll walk you through a little bit of how we do this. But we've been able to have these individuals around the table and finding importance enough that they continue to show up for that. This was a Friday morning at 7:30 we started. So working with different schedules, but that also sent a message to me too, that folks were interested in being there and be able to help and support as well. So part of ours is we usually have questions that are identified, and our board builds these questions. They do this for every one of their linkages. So this is an activity that they do around the board table monthly to prepare for the next linkage, is they develop these questions, review these questions, and provide some different opportunities. One of the biggest challenges that I think we work through, and I think any of these conversations, is not getting caught up solely on finance, of making sure that there's other connections as well. Because we've really worked on, we're going to help tell the story. We're going to talk about what our call for action is. We're going to talk about what do we see as some needs. But we want to make sure we're also identifying areas that we can also share the rest of the story with the district. And the first question, either we start with this, use first or last. And it's talking really about how do we provide that resource? How are we a resource for those folks? I said to John earlier, there's a part of me that I don't fault legislators often, because they're expected to be experts in so many different areas. So how do we really become a resource for them? I appreciate when folks do their homework, when they do some research and they ask questions. And so making sure that we're a resource for them to provide those answers and those responses and that information, I think is advantageous for us. We might not always get what we want, but I think it's still critical to have that relationship there. Talking about economic development, something that there's continued interest in. And then talking about the fiscal cliff. That's a word that I think we'll all be done using here shortly. So if anybody has a suggestion on a new word, please advocate for that. But talking about the next budget, the 23-25 budget, and how ESSER dollars are utilized. We went on to talk about equity in school funding, and we like to recap the work that took place with Representative Nygren and Governor Walker. And so that's something that we highlight too, because it's allowed a different party view on this, and just it's not always about certain legislators coming about educational finance reform, but there's really interest from all areas about this. And so how do we highlight those things too, but also highlight the work that took place at that table? Those things have taken place. Our partnership with the villages of Howard and Suamico for those funds, we bring those up just to highlight these are great things that have worked together. And we ultimately close out with a partnership slide. Again, it's kind of started that way, but also try to finish that way. So we get kind of, here are some next steps and here's what you need from us. And so this is Senator Coles. He's been a great partner in providing different information. I don't always agree with his decisions, but he's been a good resource and he is a great partner in asking questions, in being supportive of wanting to know more. And so I appreciate his partnership. This is him participating in a community leadership HSSD group we have, talking about this and the linkages and what goes on at the state level. So being able to draw him in, and I will give him accolades too, because he's the one that dedicated his team to find those funding options where the villages were able to work within the DOA and then provide those funds for us through their CARES or ESSER dollars. And so kudos to him. But again, having that resource, having that conversation has been instrumental in that. And then we identify a call to action. And we'll go through those questions. And we always want to kind of highlight, this is what we're asking you for. And this is what we want to see. And so just kind of identifying how can we partner, and then working together of what are we seeing, and then continuing to move forward. And we try to phrase these also in a way that they're direct, but they're not necessarily coming with my hand out that way. I want to provide you additional details. And I think ESSER funds have made this a little more convoluted when we talk about financing, just because there are so many variables in that and so many beliefs and thoughts on those funds. But we need to look at that. What is that long-term strategy? And I think everybody realizes that, but we need to start talking about what is that actual strategy. And so that's been a challenge that we've put out there for. I wanted to highlight some key takeaways because I think these are critical as we move forward. And even if you're not in a position to have a legislative linkage meeting, I think there's some different things that we can do with this. One of the things, tell your story. We started off there. There's great things happening in every school district. Highlight those. Highlight what's going on. There's a ton of success, and not everybody knows that. And so I think that's something that if you have students that are really well achieving, or they're doing something in the trades that has gone to the next, share that, because they don't know that, and it's bring that information as well. Providing details. One of the biggest questions I got was around our ESSER funds and then the fiscal cliff, and how does that actually impact us? What are the dollars and cents with that? So the ESSER funds, I'll show you in a second. We have those broken out on our website. And it was really nice to be able to point to, yep, that's all broken out on the website. I can send you the link for that, and you're able to see that. The fiscal cliff, having those dollars. We know what inflation looked like. We know what staff increases were. Those are items that from a sustainability are directly impacted with that fiscal cliff. So by providing that simple number for us and how that impacts us, that was able to tell the story. That's something that I'm going to continue to work on, of where are those costs that I expect to see impacted with that fiscal cliff. And I would encourage everyone to really take a look at that too, to help tell that story. There was some question about ESSER funds and creating positions, and if that's the risk that the district's going to take, that I don't know as the state how we're going to support that. But again, it's telling the story. We've added a couple positions using ESSER dollars. We've written them as grant positions and had them for 2 years, and especially around interventionists. But we're seeing so much success that it's how do we then maintain those things? And reducing that from a narrative of, well, that's a high risk position, quoting one of our legislators, to this is the impact this has had for our students, and being able to point to that data. I think the collection of that information and providing that out is something that we're going to continue to do. And I would say would be key in the meetings with the legislators. They can point to that when they talk to their caucus, they're able to highlight some of that information. Simplify school funding, key concerns, and not just asking for money. Again, for us, the revenue limit is one of our biggest points that we want to continue to talk about. For our colleagues, that's not always the case. I talked to one of our contemporaries And we talked from a larger organization, and his impact really was more around special ed funding. Well, how do we also talk about those areas? And I know John had mentioned the transfers from Fund 10 to 27 and where some of those projects are. Well, it's important for folks to know that, because we can talk about this on this call and we can understand those things, but providing that information, providing those numbers, that's real and that's impacting folks, and providing just that information of these are legislative actions that have taken place. So I want to help you understand that. I had one of our legislators ask me about where that was found in state stats and where that information was. We made sure we provided that. I provided him a link. We followed up with an email. Here it is. This is exactly where this is coming from. Here is the why. In that transition, we have to remember we're also onboarding a large number of legislators. And I say onboarding because I think that's what it needs to be. It's truly an onboarding process. A lot of decisions were made before many of them were interested in going into politics. How do we bring those things to light? And how do we also share that story? And I think coming together, and I think this is a prime example too of another development of partnerships. They've talked to us continually about collaboration and joint events. And I think that's more a scheduling thing than anything. But I think it's also us making sure we're on the same page. So if I talk about revenue limits, well, I'm in an audience that's going to be supportive, and not that other folks aren't going to be supportive on school funding, but there's other areas that folks are impacted by. And so how do we have some of those common messages? How do we come together to tell that story? And how are we supportive of one another? I mentioned earlier with our referendum discussion too, about not pitting districts against one another. I think that continues to be a critical component. And while our needs here are going to be different than others, it's still important that we're valuing their opinion and their needs to develop that collaboration. And so that's something that has come up a few times. Again, it's been a wonderful opportunity for us to continue to have some of those talking points. And we've been, while we have legislators here, making sure that we're advocating when we talk school finance across the board. Yes, here's specific Howard Suamico areas. We also know some of our neighbors aren't impacted by this. And we want to make sure you understand how they're impacted as well, and what's not solely just a Howard Suamico thing. So making sure we're telling that story and coming together. Again, highlighting partnerships that we had. I talked a little bit about our ESSER allocations. Breaking this down for folks, because I think there's a mindset of you got this windfall of money, you won the lottery, or however it's phrased, of this is all coming to you. Well, we have a lot of other expenses. We did not have that, the mask budget set. That was not something a few years ago that we were prepared for. And while that was minimal cost and we had donations coming in and those types of things, it starts to add up. And you could go through the list of all of the items with the pandemic that are just, even from a facilities and operations standpoint, that don't even get into the classroom and supporting our kids, whether it's mental health, academics, all of the other areas where support was needed for our students. And so being able to explain that and break that down has been really critical. And providing that information of, okay, we can buy these things, and these are resources we're going to have, but ultimately, how is that impacting our kids? And so that's been something that we've continued to work on. And on our website, again, we feature this. A comment was made in our linkage too about, well, providing information about that. Me being able to direct and point somebody to the website was helpful. If you drop that down, all of our ESSER 1 expenditures are in there. Our ESSER 2 expenditures are in there. ESSER 3 is part of the planning process and the community engagement. We have areas in there as well, and what the breakdown has been that way. And then we also just have a contact. Ask us questions. I know there's a lot that the media can talk about with these funds and how they're used. Ask. And we've been able to answer some questions about that. How are those being utilized? And I think that's put folks' mind at ease, because ours have been really focused on how are we impacting our kids, and then what are some of those additional impacts we've had where we needed to adjust technology, we needed to get different filters, all that kind of stuff that has gone over the last couple of years. That it's not just this can cover us from a budgetary standpoint. Well, these are additional costs we've had without taking inflation into play at all. And so one thing I wanted to outline as I wrap up here with this group is getting started with this. The invitations, I think this is critical. So invitations, purpose, commitment. Who are you looking to invite from your area, and what's the best way to communicate? Whether that's through an aide, whether that's directly with the person, is that phone, is that email? What's going to work the best? Is that a paper invitation? Is it all of them? Of really trying to engage and sometimes being a little bit of a pest in order to find a way to make that happen. In Kenosha County, as John mentioned, we were able to put together a group from Kenosha, Racine, and Walworth counties. We had probably 10 legislators there and had Speaker Voss there too, which was an outstanding partnership in being able to connect. Well, we talked to one of our representatives who got us in touch with Representative Voss's office, worked with one of the aides, and ultimately brought this group together. What they had asked for was, can we have a larger group which represents different areas? Well, we pulled a number of districts. And if you're not familiar with that area, there's a lot of K-8, 9, 12 districts. So there's quite a few in that area. But we came together and we found ways to then invite, send thank you notes, those little things that go a long way. But also got folks around the table. The purpose, what do you hope to accomplish? And I think this needs to be really communicated on the front end at the meeting and then afterwards, because we can say, oh, we want to get together and talk about school finance. No, we want to talk about our partnership and making sure that that can be communicated. And if your board's really in the driver's seat of this, that they can all clearly communicate and have identified their purpose as well. And then the commitments. We do a reflection at the board table every month. We talk about what we heard, we talk about next steps, and we talk about different actions. And that's led to an adjustment where we actually have 2 legislative linkages. It also talks about our follow-up with those folks in legislative advocacy, but it's something that is an ongoing on the board agenda. And that's been critical for folks to engage in that. So these would be some keys that if you were looking to start this process that I would highlight. And then again, since I gave you more quotes, I think it's critical in our roles. We don't always see what's impacting the classroom and what's impacting our students. And our team talks about this quite a bit, because when you have, facilities and finance, while we'll see the kids and we see what's going on in the classroom and we see our teachers, it's just understanding, are we doing what we can to make sure that they have what they need? And that to me is one of our biggest goals, something we should continue to strive for, because while it's in the background, it's impacting those kids and the rest of their lives. And so I think that's critical when we talk about this, that extra phone call, that extra meeting. Well, that's impacting somebody, and just to keep that in mind. So with that, I open it up for any questions, and thank you everybody for your time this morning.
Mike, this is so helpful and so interesting. I really appreciate everything that you shared. And I want to open it up for questions. Just a couple things to get us started, and I guess a little bit more of a comment at the start. But my experience with this is that I guess you talked about the idea of being a sort of a bigger district with a sort of a bigger footprint. But my experience being a superintendent in a small district was that legislators were very willing to come and visit with me, visit with a board member, and spend some time just talking in my office. And my goal was just to extend the invitation and share with them more about what was going on in our district. A couple of times I would go to, they would have area meetings and I would go and just share a little bit, but then I'd take a picture with that legislator and put it up on our social media page, and have an opportunity for them to be seen in our community as folks who are interested in learning more. Like you said, we may not agree on everything, but establishing those relationships and creating an open line of communication can be really important. So I guess just by way of supporting and appreciating what you said, it doesn't necessarily have to be a large meeting like that. There are a variety of ways to establish those relationships, and all of them I think can be very effective. But kudos for the ones that you have been doing, because that just looks amazing to get all those folks at the table.
Yeah, it's been wonderful. And again, in the Green Bay area, we have access to a lot of major companies, some CEOs, those types of folks. And when the CEO of Microsoft wants to do a tour, it's pretty easy to pull some legislators into those type of events. But yeah, we try to highlight that. And I think one of the things that I've heard from them too is just acknowledging when good things are happening too. I think they get beat up on a lot of different things too, but there are things that are going on that are supporting education and making sure we're highlighting that. So whether that's the photo op too, or the thank you there, it is critical to help engage them.
Yeah, really interesting. What other questions are out there? I see we've got quite a few folks with us this afternoon and folks from across the state. Anybody have other questions or thoughts or comments with Mike?
Hi, Mike.
I can prattle on. There's Janelle. Yeah.
Yeah, I know our districts are quite different, and we do a lot of referendum communications too. But I guess like John, I think it's really complimentary how you can pull people in like that and have those conversations. I like the way you're doing the ESSER communications too. I think that's really transparent and pretty simple to follow for your residents.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a good thing, well received. And again, going through the referendum campaign to point to those specifics it made presenting to a community group a lot easier. But it also, I think it provided good information, because I think folks forget some of the other challenges that we worked through when we were all ordering hand sanitizer and everything under the sun that we needed to get.
Yeah, that's awesome that you're able to pull everybody in like that. Great job.
Thank you.
Mike, are you, looking back over the last sort of budget cycle and just other legislative things that happened in the past 3 or 4 years? Well, I guess you've only been in Howard for 2, but even before that, you mentioned the meeting with Speaker Voss. What sorts of things have you felt like you've been able to sort of steer in the context of the legislative process?
I would love to say, hey, we're going to steer a number of things that way, but I think,
influence, I guess, is a better.
No, and I think I think I speak to, and that was work that was done here before.
Yes, hey, we got our new printer today.
Yay!
Just letting you know, and they were super nice and kind of showed us all the stuff. And
there we go. Sorry about that. I was able
that's
to mute that person.
No, that's fine. I think the work that Howard Swamico did back with Representative Nygren and Governor Walker is a huge example of that too. I think that when the safety grants were starting, because of the work we had done down in Kenosha County, our representative down there, she picked up the phone, said, Mike, I'm walking in to vote. Give me your thoughts on this. Well, that was, I was glad I picked up my cell phone at that time. But those types of things, those relationships that then were established because of these conversations, that's probably the biggest impact that way. And I think, to me, it's really about providing them information. When they talk to their colleagues, they can point to something. And again, we might not get the result that we want to see, but at least we've shared that story. And so, I mean, that the safety grant one is probably the most like in your face example of that too, but that was real. And so was it worth that time that we spent that way to have that one conversation? I believe so. And I think that's where, when we talk about that work and even the adjustments with the revenue limit, that's impacted years and years worth of work. So I think I don't know that you ever really know the impact you're going to have, but those have shined a light on the importance of this work.
Keep planting seeds. Yeah. Or acorns, so to speak. Yeah, I remember those safety grants, and we used that to improve an entryway at our elementary school in my district, and that was a big deal. And it's a little bit touching now to remember when that kind of thing was the foremost thing in our minds.
Right, definitely.
Before the COVID. So, other questions, comments, thoughts, and ideas to share?
John, this is Tim.
Hey, Tim.
Hey, one of the things I find really hard to do in advocating with legislators is trying to find that balance of thanking them for what they did give, like categorical aids, but still having it be the big issue of equalization aid and things that we're not getting, to try and keep them looking at that picture. Because a lot of times they just want to hear, thank yous for everything they've done and don't like hearing what should have been done. They just kind of think we're whining about everything, I guess.
Yeah,
Tim, Mike, thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Tim. Definitely the balance that way too is, yes, folks always want to hear thank you a little bit more. I think it's critical, but I also think it's the telling the story of what are some of those dollars with that too. If we talk about transfer, and John, I'll keep using your example here, but a special education transfer, being able to explain how are some of those things impacting us and using real examples for that. And again, for us, if I want to give a real example, probably the most in your face kind of example I can give is if you really want us to stop going to the ballot box asking for a operational referendum, this is what we need to adjust. And so kind of building off of some of that, of being able to show these are things that we're able to do, and this is how that impacts us. And John, you calculated that for us with the $134 million. Well, those are critical stories to share. And so I think, Tim, what I would say with that too is what are you able to do? What would you like to see happen too? So it's not just, hey, this is the money I'm asking for. So it's not just coming with your hand out that way too. It's explaining some of that information, because I think we're putting more money into education type of narrative. While that might be accurate on things, this is how this could better impact us if we did this, as opposed to, doing a one-time aid or per pupil increases. Well, these are things that could impact us, and just helping to show that with real numbers. And also just giving some of those examples to me has been something that I try to do. I don't know that I'm always the best at it, but I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges. So I appreciate the question / thought, and agree with you that it's definitely, I don't want to say all thank yous, because there's still work we need to do.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I know there's a lot of discord, so to speak, between certain legislative positions. And certainly a lot of us were very disappointed at a lack of change in revenue limits and very limited change in special education funding in this last budget cycle. And yet, as with family members who we disagree with on politics, you say, I don't agree with that decision, but I love you, and let's keep working together. And we're going to keep going to Christmas gatherings, and we'll see you there. So, well, this is really helpful. Thank you, Mike. I don't want to wrap up. There are any other questions or comments before we close out?
John, just one other comment regarding referendum that's worked well with us in our 4 or 5 successful referendums is, creating perceptions with our community that we are being transparent, because we are. But then the other thing is we have to document all of that. I always push for putting whatever meeting we've had, whatever we've discussed, put it on the website, because what's going to happen. You get down close to voting for it, people say, well, why didn't I know about that? Well, if they could go to the website and see we had this meeting, this document was mailed, there was availability for you to be at this meeting and what it was talked about. And I think that gives more trust for the board, a little bit more integrity as things go through towards the end. I mean, we're actually doing the work, but we're also creating the perception, because for a lot of people, that's reality, to be able to know what we've done and that we've done things the right way, and they can trust what we're doing.
Yeah, Mike?
Yeah, Tim, agree with you completely. And I think that's where, when I look at our website, we were able to do that. We broke down all of our 2018 referendum expenditures to the penny. So we broke down things that were being done, positions that we were being added, where our class sizes were. I think it was key. And to be able to point to that as well and utilize that as a resource, I agree with you 100% and found that as one of the most useful tools. Even in some of those community information sessions, it wasn't just go to the website. Well, I can pull that up and show you. And so, Tim, I agree with you completely. And I don't know that I could have said it any better. So well done, sir.
Yeah. And it really relates to a couple of things that you said earlier, Mike. First of all, simplifying the information. It's great to be transparent, but if you're transparent with a 20,000 page budget, that's not really transparency because it's not understandable. But you also talked earlier about when certain community members had asked your boards, both current board and in the past, what have you done to try to ameliorate this problem in the past? Let me show you. It's all here. And that goes a lot, I would imagine, went a long way to establishing credibility and a recognition of their concern. And like, yeah, we get it. We're really working hard to try to solve these problems.
Right. And meeting with legislators, that comment alone probably shut down the most, oh, really? That type of response that was given with that too. And just to be able to point to, they don't want the content of the conversation. They want to know that you're doing it. So that's been really powerful to be able to say that.
Good. Well, listen, we need to wrap up this morning. Thank you so very much for your time, Mike. Thanks everybody for joining us today and the questions and comments. Really interesting stuff. I encourage everybody who's able to watch this workshop to start building those legislative linkages. It's just critical, and telling your story in a way that you've done so effectively and just in a welcoming way, establishing relationships in a positive way, recognizing that there are challenges with funding and funding cliffs, and that's okay to talk about, but also the other things that you've got going on that are great things, and the opportunity to talk about career and technical education. How do we best connect with your offices? How can we best be transparent about our story? All those are good questions for legislators, and certainly things that I'm sure helps to engage them and help them feel a part of the school community. So thanks again, Mike. Really appreciate your time. And I'm going to shut off the recording here, and then we can close up shop.